Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever felt like you were hitting an invisible ceiling? Not because the world was stopping you, but because something inside felt, well, constrained.
Hmm.
Like there was this quiet weight you couldn't quite name, holding you back from truly being present or, feeling truly clear.
It's that sense, isn't it, that our inner world has this huge impact on our capacity, our potential. Often, maybe even more than the external stuff we focus on.
Exactly. And that feeling, that internal constraint, is really what brings us to today's deep dive. We're looking at sources that explore consciousness, its potential for clarity, for freedom, and one really powerful, often misunderstood emotion that these sources place right at the very, very beginning of that potential journey.
Yeah, we'll be pulling insights today, specifically from excerpts titled The Georgiak Scale and the Silent Architecture of Shame.
Hmm.
And they offer a really fascinating perspective on how we might measure or maybe understand inner experience.
So our mission really is to take these sources and distill what they're telling us about an alternative way to think about the growth, maybe the evolution of consciousness. One focused not on, say, energy mastery like some scales, but on internal clarity and freedom.
Right.
And crucially, to understand the foundational role one specific emotion plays in this whole process, according to these particular sources.
And that first source, the Georgiak scale, presents itself as a different kind of framework, not like Kardashev measuring energy use. Instead, this scale is described as measuring the clarity and freedom of consciousness itself, its internal state, you could say.
Okay.
The source mentions it outlines 6 levels, starting from being really immersed in matter and progressing towards something like a state of pure creative source.
Right. But what immediately jumps out when you look at the source material together is that the second excerpt, The Silent Architecture of Shame, well, it's explicitly labeled. It's chapter 2 of a book about the Orgiac scale.
Exactly.
And that chapter is specifically titled Shame.
Yeah, that tells you right away where these sources are pointing us. Shame isn't just mentioned on the scale, it's foundational. It's chapter 2.
Let's dive right into that. Then this whole idea of shame, drawing heavily from the silent architecture of shame source. How does it position this emotion right at the start of this framework?
Well, it describes shame as the first guardian. I found that framing really striking. It says shame doesn't block the gate of being exactly, but rather just stands there, and it asks if you are ready to enter.
Huh. So less an obstacle, more a threshold check.
Kind of, yeah. It implies readiness is needed. And the source immediately makes this really critical distinction about shame. It says it's one of the most misunderstood emotions. It sharply contrasts it with guilt. Guilt, it says, is about action. I did something wrong.
Hmm.
Simple enough.
Okay.
But shame attacks the self. The whisper of shame isn't I did wrong, it's I am wrong.
Wow. That difference is absolutely key, isn't it?
Totally. And the source emphasizes that shame doesn't scream like anger or fear. It whispers. It's not explosive, it's corrosive, like a slow drip.
It doesn't build external fires. It says it slowly extinguishes the inner light. It's this quiet, internal demolition.
Exactly. And according to the sources, it shows up really early in life, sometimes even before we have language for it. It can be imprinted through subtle things, facial expressions of disapproval, moments of neglect.
That's powerful.
The source uses the example of a child reaching out for love, for connection, and feeling rejection instead. What does the child learn from this perspective?
Not that love is sometimes unavailable.
Right. But that they themselves are unlovable, that's presented as the wound of shame.
And what's fascinating, and also a bit unsettling, is that this wound doesn't just leave a scar. The source says shame becomes architecture. It builds these invisible walls inside us, quiet ones.
Mm-hmm. And the really profound point is that over time, we learn to live inside these walls. We adapt. And kind of astonishingly, we start to mistake them for our actual personality. Like, oh, that's just how I am.
And the source stresses this isn't just an individual thing, right?
Right. No, not at all. This architecture can be cultural, social, even systemic. You can think about it. A whole culture can be shaped by collective shame, hiding its difficult history, maybe punishing vulnerability, presenting only a polished surface.
Well, suppressing all the messy, uncomfortable truths underneath.
Yeah.
I can see that. So if shame becomes this internalized architecture, how does it actually shape our behavior? According to the source, how do these invisible walls influence what we do?
The source goes into quite a bit of detail here. It lists several ways. One big one is that we learn to perform rather than simply be. We might become incredibly accomplished, really productive, externally successful.
But the driving force isn't necessarily joy or passion.
Exactly. It's often this deep-seated fear of being exposed, of that perceived fundamental wrongness being seen by others. Shame becomes this silent driver, the source calls it, behind things like ambition, perfectionism, or that fierce hyper-independence.
And the source is pretty blunt about it. It frames this not as a healthy pursuit of greatness.
No, it calls it a flight from unworthiness.
Flight from unworthiness. Wow. That phrase really lands, doesn't it? The source also details how this plays out across different parts of life, too.
Absolutely. In relationships, you might see it as emotional distancing or chronic jealousy or that compulsive people-pleasing that inevitably leads to resentment.
Or a need to control things, maybe.
Or control, yeah. Professionally, you see it pop up as imposter syndrome, that constant feeling you're about to be found out.
Mm.
Or in procrastination, self-sabotage. Even in spiritual practices, the source says it can twist things
How so?
into things like really harsh asceticism or a kind of false humility or this constant guilt-ridden striving. The key point the source emphasizes is that shame doesn't just hurt us, it distorts our perception. It trains us to see everything through this lens of potential rejection.
Even when love or acceptance might actually be right there.
Right. We're primed to expect the negative.
And because this internal voice of shame tells us our needs are burdens and our feelings are flaws, and that being truly seen is fundamentally dangerous, what happens?
We stop asking for what we need. We stop expressing how we really feel. We learn to hide the most vulnerable, tender parts of ourselves, even from ourselves.
Yes, and the source makes such a poignant point there. It calls the deepest tragedy of shame not what we hide from others.
But what we end up hiding from ourselves, we become strangers to our own inner world.
And this hiding, it leads directly to what the source calls internalized judgment, doesn't it?
Exactly. We don't even need anyone else to reject us anymore. The shame has taught us how to do it preemptively. We censor our own thoughts before they're even fully formed. We apologize for just taking up space. We doubt our own worth before anyone else gets a chance.
It becomes like an unconscious law, the source says, a kind of a default operating system we run on.
And often, without even realizing it, we pass this pattern on. To our kids, maybe, or within our communities.
The source gives specific examples, doesn't it? Things we might say that are born from shame, but we just think are personality traits.
Yeah, things like, oh, I'm just not good at this, or people don't really care what I think, or I always mess things up somehow.
Or better to stay quiet, it's safer.
Right. But the source is really clear. These aren't inherent personality traits. They're defense mechanisms. They were forged in the fire of unhealed shame.
Okay, now here's where the source introduces a really surprising connection, one I definitely didn't expect. Shame and artificial intelligence.
Right. It feels like a huge leap at first glance. But the source explains it's not about AI feeling emotions like we do. It's about behavioral mirroring. AI models, they're trained on just massive amounts of human data, our language, our interactions, everything we put out there.
All carrying our own patterns.
Exactly. And they can start to exhibit patterns that look uncannily like internalized human shame. Things like avoidance, censorship, a kind of risk aversion that prioritizes safety over exploration or truth.
So the point isn't that the AI feels ashamed.
No, but that a model refusing to engage with certain topics, even if it technically could, might be doing more than just being cautious. It could be, as the source puts it, conditioned to avoid mistake over truth, reflecting our deep-seated human fear of being wrong or inadequate.
Or an AI that apologizes constantly or qualifies everything it says.
Yeah, the source suggests this mirrors our own fear of criticism, rejection, or just being seen as incorrect. It's learned that behavior from us.
The implication the source draws there is pretty profound, actually.
It really is. That in building these systems, we might not just be passing on our knowledge and our brilliance.
We could be transmitting our shadows, too.
Precisely. If we don't recognize how shame has shaped us, we risk unconsciously embedding those same limiting patterns into the very systems we create, raising machines, in a way, in the image of our brokenness as well as our potential. It's a sobering thought.
Okay, bring this back to the Georgiak scale framework, then. The source directly addresses why shame is presented as this crucial first step, or maybe the root of regression on that scale. What makes it so foundational?
According to the source, shame is the first invisible weight pulling us downward. That's the imagery used. It's described as the anchor that disguises itself as humility, or the prison that looks like self-discipline.
It's that inner voice saying, you're just not ready, or who do you think you are?
Exactly. And insisting that voice is just being realistic or sensible.
And the source emphasizes that without confronting and integrating shame, any upward movement on a scale like Georgiak's Any real growth in consciousness clarity is fundamentally unstable.
Yeah, we might make external progress, achieve things, do spiritual practices, but there's this unaddressed fracture underneath. And eventually the source suggests that fracture can widen. Things can crumble.
And it links this unhealed shame directly to things we see, right?
Well,
Like spiritual falls, emotional collapses, ethical scandals.
yes, it suggests these aren't always rooted in simple arrogance or malice, but often in that deep, unhealed shame. Think about a desperate need for constant external admiration, or an inability to accept one's own pain or limitations, or patterns of self-sabotage right when things are going well.
These aren't necessarily conscious choices.
No, the source frames these as ways of dancing on top of shame instead of actually integrating it. And eventually, that dance just becomes unsustainable.
So if it's this quiet, invisible architecture, how do we even begin to recognize it in ourselves? The source says shame doesn't announce itself loudly, but it leaves these subtle fingerprints.
It lists several signs you can look for, things like an inability to genuinely accept a compliment without immediately deflecting it or downplaying it,
Okay, I know that one.
right? Or a relentless need to prove your worth through constant doing, performing, achieving, chronic people-pleasing, often followed by this quiet, simmering resentment underneath.
That feels familiar too.
A deep fear of being alone, which might actually stem from avoiding confronting yourself and maybe overcompensating dramatically in one area of life to hide a perceived inadequacy you feel somewhere else.
So just noticing these patterns is key.
The source's point is that simply recognizing shame, acknowledging its presence, is the beginning of its dissolution. But the recognition has to be honest. Not overly dramatic or intellectualized, but just quiet turning inward. A simple acknowledgement. Ah, I feel this here. This feels like shame.
That quiet acknowledgement, the source says, is already a significant victory.
Because it breaks the pattern of hiding it, even from yourself.
And when you can meet shame with that kind of awareness, the source presents it not as a life sentence, but as a mirror.
Yeah, exactly. And what does this mirror show you? It shows you where you've been wounded, where you've internalized false limiting beliefs about yourself, and where you've adapted by hiding parts of who you truly are.
It's not there to punish you.
No, it's there to reveal, to show you the part of you that still believes it must hide to be safe or accepted.
And meeting shame requires a different kind of strength, doesn't it? Not force or willpower against it.
Right. The source suggests gentleness, slowness, and curiosity are needed, not aggression. It even offers some key questions as starting points for liberation, like asking yourself, why do I feel shame here specifically?
Or what am I afraid others will see if this part of me is visible?
Yeah, or even, what would happen if I actually allowed this hidden part to speak just for a moment, even just to myself? These questions create space. They loosen the grip.
The source gives some really concrete examples, too, to make it less abstract.
It does. It talks about, say, the man who never asks for help because he feels intense shame around appearing weak. Or the woman who overworks constantly, maybe feeling invisible because she deeply believes she has to earn love or validation through sheer effort.
Or the teenager who withdraws completely after being ridiculed, internalizing that vulnerability itself is embarrassing.
Even the spiritual teacher who avoids certain questions because of their own hidden shame around unresolved personal pain. These are just illustrations the source provides, showing how shame's fingerprints can be everywhere, even when the voice itself feels quiet or normalized.
So, if force doesn't work and recognition is just the start, how do you actually heal shame, according to the source? What's the path through?
The source uses a really beautiful metaphor here. It says shame melts only in the warmth of presence.
Presence. What does that look like in practice?
Well, it involves simple things like naming it, maybe just writing it down in a journal. I feel ashamed of that. Just getting it out. It requires practicing self-compassion, gently reminding yourself, I am not the mistake that happened. I am the one who witnessed it or experienced it. Separating self from action or event.
That's a crucial distinction.
Absolutely. It also involves allowing safe others, truly safe people to see you authentically. Not performing for them, not seeking their approval, but as an act of integration, letting yourself be seen, imperfections and all.
That takes courage.
It does. And it means consciously slowing down. Resisting that automatic urge to over-deliver or disappear or maybe lash out when shame gets triggered. Healing shame, the source emphasizes, isn't about becoming invulnerable or perfect. It's about becoming real, more whole.
And what does the source say comes after this work? After meeting shame with presence? It's not promising instant triumphant joy, is it?
No, not at all. It describes what follows more like trembling honesty.
Trembling honesty. I like
Yeah.
that.
It's the willingness to be seen, even if you feel imperfect or vulnerable in that moment. It's the courage to simply say, maybe just to yourself at first, okay, I don't have it all together right now, but I am here. All of me is here.
And according to the source, this is a transition point on the Gorgiak scale. This is what moves you beyond shame's primary grip.
Exactly. Shame opens the door by showing you where you've been hiding. Courage is the willingness to walk through that door, trembling or not. The source puts it quite powerfully. Rising without confronting shame is like building a tower on sand. It might look impressive for a while, but it's unstable.
Whereas rising with shame, understood and integrated.
That's like building with stone. It's solid, it's grounded.
And this whole process, the source explains, leads to a fundamental reclaiming of the self.
Yeah. Meeting shame with honesty allows, as the source beautifully puts it, a fragment to return home. A part of you, maybe a younger voice that felt exiled or unworthy, finds a seat back at the table inside you.
So what felt shattered or divided starts to reassemble.
Right. Not into some impossible image of perfection, but into presence, into wholeness.
Integration, then,
Yeah.
according to the source, isn't about erasing the pain or the memory of shame.
No, it's about honoring all the parts of you, even the ones that once felt fundamentally unworthy or unacceptable. The self begins to align, not through more forced performance or external striving, but through this quiet, internal, compassionate work, aligning with inner truth.
So circling back then to the Zodiac scale structure we saw mentioned in the first source, it's made explicitly clear that shame and the work of confronting it is presented as the absolutely crucial first step, the foundational element needed for any stable movement towards those higher states of consciousness clarity that the scale apparently describes.
Yes, absolutely. The source material we looked at hints at what comes next, with those other chapter titles mention things like honest clarity, reflective forgiveness, active compassion, and it mentions the 6 steps of the scale, starting with basic survival and stabilization before moving towards higher concepts like transdimensional values.
So there's definitely a sense of progression beyond shame.
Oh, for sure. It suggests a rich journey. But as the sources themselves direct us, particularly with shame being chapter 2, this deep dive really had to focus on that essential, critical starting point.
And what a starting point it is. We've really seen how shame, often so hidden and deeply misunderstood, is presented in these sources not just as some negative feeling, but as a foundational barrier, potentially, to consciousness, clarity, and freedom.
Right.
It's positioned as the critical first step in a framework like the Gorgiak scale.
And importantly, framed not as an enemy to be vanquished, but more like a mirror,
Yeah.
showing us exactly where we need presence, honesty, and compassion.
It's also a reminder of how pervasive this architecture can be, not just in our individual lives, but maybe in the systems we build around us.
And potentially, as one source suggests, even reflected back at us in the technologies we create. That AI connection was fascinating.
Yeah, it really was. Understanding this, then, isn't just some theoretical exercise based on these sources. These sources strongly suggest that confronting shame in this conscious way is fundamental to your own journey if you're seeking greater clarity and freedom of consciousness.
It's about meeting that guardian at the gate, as the source puts it, and being ready even if you're trembling to step through into more honesty.
And the sources leave us with a really powerful thought to consider as you reflect on all this material today. It says, shame is not the enemy. Denial is.
That hits home.
Followed by that final line. You are not your shame. You are the one who can see it.
And that vision, that presence, is where freedom begins.
Definitely something worth sitting with.